and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to another edition of Custom House Maritime Matters. I'm Dr. George Procacci, your host. Our co-host is not here, and I have a bit of an explanation to make for that because she hasn't been here for the last 2 or 3 shows. I think you know, if you've been watching, that we have had an extremely busy summer, which has continued into the fall, mainly having to do with the lighthouse visitations, which continue, although I think the last one is this coming Saturday, all fully booked. And in addition to that, we've got a lot of other things going on with the lighthouses, which we own, the 2 of them, and with the Ledge Light, which we're making an application for. This all goes on her plate, so she's very busy, and when possible, we'd like to make sure that she gets a little time off, and this is one of the times. And I know for sure that the shows are definitely better when she's here, but I'll soldier on with great guests as usual, and we have a great guest today for you. The subject for today is diving for ships, for treasure, and for history. And we're fortunate to have a diver who has accomplished that. As a matter of fact, a show of his most recent activity is now an exhibit at the Custom House Maritime Museum, and you're more than welcome to and urged to come down and see it. But Mark Munro, thank you very much for coming, and we look forward to a lot of information coming from you about your life and activities. But what we always do first, as the folks know, is that we ask the guest if you can give us an idea of your education, training, experience, how you got into this, and then we'll go on.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me. I'm born and raised in New London. I was born in L&M Hospital and moved to the other side of the river age 5 to Groton, and went to school in Groton, and went to Thames Valley State Technical College. Got my first degree, associate's degree in mechanical engineering technology from Thames Valley. And then I went to work, started working at Millstone, a nuclear power station, and I have been there for 25 years, working in the simulator training department. I maintain the 2 simulators that we currently have in the simulator training facility there. I went back and got a second degree from Thames Valley and got that in electrical engineering technology, so 2 associate's degrees. And I started diving here locally back in 1989. Was when I first got certified. And certified in scuba diving. And I always had an interest in it. I think there's a picture of me that my mother took that I have that is always in my mind. I think about, and it's a picture of me in my pajamas, with masks, fins, and snorkel in front of the TV watching Jacques Cousteau.
Oh, that's great.
When I was about 10 years old.
I'm glad you captured that.
So I've had a long time interest in diving. But it wasn't until 1989 that I finally got certified locally and started diving. And just originally it was diving from shore and just enjoyed being in the water and seeing the marine life. And it was about 1990, 1991 that I was introduced to wreck diving through Seacon Dive Club, which is a dive club that operates out of Montville. And I started diving off a few boats out of Mystic, and was introduced to shipwrecks, and just found that I had a deep interest in diving shipwrecks, and my family history. We've a lot of watermen in relatives, distant relatives. So I have sort of had water in the blood, and I just enjoy being on the water and in the water, and also the historical aspect of the shipwrecks. There's a lot to be learned and done diving shipwrecks. It just makes it very, very interesting.
Absolutely, and you gave me a great segue into the next part of the show, And that always is my effort to set the table, so to speak, in terms of the subject matter. And in thinking about it, I found that the subject matter for today divides itself among three aspects, and one is shipwrecks themselves, and why the interest, why the fascination, and the second has to do with the science of diving. It's not a game. It's a skill. It's a science, and it's potentially at any particular moment dangerous. So you really have to know what you're doing. And the third thing has to do with your most recent activity in terms of finding the Phyllis, which we'll talk about. But first, why this fascination with shipwrecks, and for that matter, why the fascination with the sea at all? And we all certainly have an innate fascination, having come not environmentally, but evolutionary from the sea, recognizing that 3/4 of the earth is water, recognizing that the sea is not something that is natural to us, being air breathers, and speaking personally, I certified in scuba in the 70s, and I did scuba diving, but that was always different to me than being a fair amount of time in grizzly bear country in northwest Wyoming, carrying a .44 Magnum, walking around by myself and being fairly comfortable at that. With scuba diving, you can't be really comfortable. You have to be on your toes because it's a foreign environment. So that adds to the fascination. What also adds to the fascination is the concept of folks going to the sea in ships and having the unfortunate occurrence of shipwrecks. This is a book that I found several years ago. Not a fine book, A History of Disasters at Sea. Not a fine topic, but very, very informational. And to give you some idea, I won't belabor this, but humans are unable to survive for long in open water. They cannot drink seawater and quickly begin to suffer from hypothermia and cramping, struggling to stay afloat. They make easy targets for sea creatures. Accounts litter the history of seafaring attacks, etc. Large ships themselves create a dangerous suction when they submerge. They can pull survivors down with them. There are sections, courage and cowardice in the extreme situation that occurs there, and we might or might not have seen both with the Concordia that is now under court investigation, and a great feat of engineering to have taken it off its side. And through all this, we always have to wonder whether what happened was an act of God or human error. And there are famous wrecks, and we've all heard of them. For example, one of the most famous ones was the Essex, which in 1820 a whaler was stove in by a sperm whale and sank, and that gave Herman Melville the idea for Moby Dick. So that was real. And then there's the Hunley in the Civil War, and the Titanic, and the Endurance of Shackleford, the Arizona, the Indianapolis, the Kursk, the Russian nuclear submarine. So there's a lot there that captures the imagination. And then there is the issue of the science of diving and the medicine of diving, and we'll get into just what's involved, not in great detail, but let me tell you that diving injuries do occur, and they occur in an overexpansion injury, drowning injury, decompression sickness of the bends, and all of these things are predictable and avoidable, and sometimes they happen anyway. And on top of that, the science of hyperbaric medicine has produced treatments and cures for a variety of things, not only including the bends, but also including gas embolism, carbon monoxide poisoning, cyanide poisoning, gas gangrene, necrotizing soft tissue infections, brain abscess, crush injuries. So this is a very broad field. And underlying all that is a history of just what happened on that particular day, and how can the diver put together in a detective type fashion what did happen, and that's exactly what it is. It's detective work. So Mark, starting wherever you like, can you tell us anything and all about that?
About the Phyllis, please.
Sure, the Phyllis to start with.
Okay. Actually, I mentioned I started shipwreck diving in about 1991.
Mm-hmm.
Along our shores, there are many wrecks. Between Watch Hill and Point Judith, there's at least a dozen shipwrecks, and one of the most tragic is the Larchmont that went down in 1902 in the winter. And you were talking earlier about the story, why people like shipwrecks, and why they have such interest in it. And it has, I think, the human element, like you were mentioning, of loss, tragedy, has a lot to do with shipwrecks. And the history behind them. There's a lot of history behind the Larchmont as a sidewheel steamer in Long Island Sound. So as I was diving these shipwrecks, I started to get interested in the history of these wrecks, not just the shipwrecks themselves physically. And as I was looking into the history, I realized that there were wrecks in the area that hadn't been found yet, that nobody was diving. So at the time, I did not have the technology to look for shipwrecks. We had rudimentary technology using just a regular echo sounder, which would show you a two-dimensional image of the bottom, but it didn't cover a very large area. So
Talk about the bottom. How deep is the bottom in these waters?
Typically in Block Island Sound, it would be about 120 feet. Most of the wrecks that we're diving are anywhere from 50 to 120 feet south of Block Island. There's a few wrecks that we're diving in the 160 range to 200 feet. So that's what the average wreck depth that we're diving is in the 80 to 120 foot depth.
Okay.
So in 1996, there was a presentation that was being given at Avery Point at the Bradford House, and it dealt with the side scan sonar surveys that USGS had done in Long Island Sound.
And side scan is exactly that.
Side scan sonar uses sound to image the sea bottom and give you an image of what's on the bottom. They were looking at topography and sediments that were on the bottom to find out, interested in habitat for fish and marine life.
Now, does side scan simply double your view, or does it give you anything like a simultaneous, almost three-dimensional type thing?
Well, it gives you an image of sort of a photograph of what the bottom looks like, what's on the bottom. It uses sound and sound reflections off of anything that's sticking off the bottom, that's protruding from the bottom. It will give you that image, and it's acquired by towing a towfish that has two transducers, one on each side, that puts a sound pulse into the water and looks to the side, hence the name.
Looks like a torpedo.
Looks like a torpedo.
Yeah, we have that as part of the exhibit.
Correct. And puts a sound pulse into the water column and draws a image of the bottom line by line as that towfish progresses across the bottom. And depending on the type of sonar that you're using, you can cover anywhere from 600 feet across to shorter distance to even lower frequency that doesn't give you a very good resolution, a nice picture, up to possibly a mile across. They were using a lower frequency side scan sonar system and looking at 100 meters per side, so 300 meters total.
Who was using?
USGS, when they did these surveys in Long Island Sound.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, I was going to the presentation at Avery Point.
Right.
They were talking about these side scan surveys that were done by the USGS. And I went and I saw this talk, and I was interested, and of course they were using it to find, look at the bottom for habitat and habitat type, and I was interested in possibly using it to find shipwrecks. So I went to Avery Point Long Island Sound Research Center, and as I mentioned, you cover a small part of the bottom. Maybe they were using 300 meters total, but they have a technology, it's digitized, so they can take all those individual paths and put them into a mosaic. And at the Long Island Sound Resource Center, they had a mosaic there of Fisher's Island Sound. I was primarily interested in Fisher's Island Sound at the time. And so I thought I would ground truth and just say, okay, I know there's a large shipwreck in Fisher's Island Sound. I know exactly where it is. It's a barge that's upside down with a crane. Let me look at the mosaic, and if I can see that on that mosaic, I'll know I'll be able to find other shipwrecks. And I went and looked, and I was unable to see it in the mosaic. So I gave up at that time, and that was 1996.
And why was that? In retrospect, would you say, why was that?
Well, in retrospect,
because they were using low frequency?
It was because, well, one, they went right over the top of the wreck when they were doing the survey with the towfish, and two, the navigation and the geo data that was associated with the mosaic was off a little bit. So actually, it did show up in the mosaic, but not where it was supposed to. Yeah. So in 2002, I purchased my own side scan sonar system and started looking for wrecks myself. And this was a paper-based system. It wasn't a digital system similar to what they used in USGS survey. And it wasn't until about 2003 that I was able to read those digital sonar files. So I went to USGS and asked them for the original data so that I could look at it. And they obliged, and I was able to get that original data. And I spent the winter of 2006, 2007 reviewing that data. And it was at that time that I realized why I did not see this wreck that I had looked for before, because they had gone right over the top of it. And so I sat down, spent the winter going through the data and picking out targets that I thought were potential shipwrecks. And I came up with about a half dozen that I thought might be shipwrecks. And so in the spring of 2007, we went out and started looking at these targets, rescanning them. As I mentioned, they were using a lower resolution side scan. So I used my side scan sonar and a higher resolution to go out and look at these targets to see if, yes, they are shipwrecks or they were not. And I came up with 3 that were really interesting. And sometimes when you're looking at the side scan sonar, it's not a perfect picture. And this sort of goes back to, I think, what you were talking about, shipwrecks and why people are interested in them. You have an opaque surface of the ocean, and you have something below it, but you can't see it. You use technology to be able to look at it, side scan, but you still can't get a perfect image of that, of what's on the bottom. It's not perfect. It keeps getting better and better with technology, but it's just not perfect. So we had these 3 targets that we thought would be very interesting. So what we did was we weren't sure exactly what they were, so we went out in the boat and dove on them. And the first one was a part of a barge. It was something. It was man-made, whether it was put there or it was part of a wreck. We're not quite sure, but it was just a piece of something, and it's always fun to find something new. Yeah. But it wasn't exactly, as a shipwreck hunter and diver, we're always looking for that wreck that no one has visited before, and is something that we can look at and explore. And so the second target that we looked at was a scuttled houseboat. And from time to time, there are vessels that are on our shores that people want to dispose of. And since they'll just tow them out and sink them. And actually, this first shipwreck that I ever did find was in Fisher's Island Sound as well, and was a scuttled boat that somebody had put down. And this was a scuttled fishing boat. Scuttled houseboat. And still interesting, something new that we did not know was there. And the third target, we weren't quite sure if it was a shipwreck, but it looked very interesting in the side scan data. And a lot of times, as I mentioned, when you look at it on the side scan data, you're not exactly sure if it is a wreck or not, so you just want to look at it. So when we dove on it, the first thing that we saw was we landed right in front of the engine, which we'll see later on in the video. And so we knew we were on a wreck. And as we started to look around, we realized that we started to see navigation lights. We actually came on that first dive, found one of the bells. So we started to see artifacts on this wreck that told us that it hadn't been explored before. Mm-hmm. Nobody had found it before. So we started to look at the wreck, and it was right in the middle of Fisher's Island Sound. And it was about 75 feet of water.
Is this a good time to show it and to talk over the video? What do you think?
I think if we wait until we get to the end.
Fine. Go ahead.
And everybody have an idea of what the wreck is before we look at it. Mm-hmm. When you look at shipwrecks, depending on how old they are, most people think of, if you see the images of the Titanic, it's still standing proud off the bottom. It's an iron vessel, and although it's deteriorated a lot, it hasn't deteriorated to the point where it's just splayed across the bottom. This was a wooden vessel that we had found, so the prominent part of the wreck was just the engine. There's still wood around the wreck and the keel to the vessel, but there's really not much to it. So we didn't know what type of vessel it was. So what we started to do was identify the artifacts that we found and where we found them on the wreck to sort of figure out what type of vessel this might have been in the configuration.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's the detective work.
This is the detective work. And also hopefully finding something that might help us to identify it.
Yeah.
Because ultimately we know that we found a shipwreck that no one knew was here, and we'd like to put a name to her.
Sure.
And find the history and learn about the wreck.
Right.
So we came up with what we believed the vessel looked like. But we weren't able to find anything that helped us to identify it. So since it's right in Fisher's Island Sound, right off of Noank, I thought the best thing to do would be to talk to the Noank watermen who have been around there for a long time to see if they heard of a vessel that no one had located previously. So talked to Ben Rathburn, Arnold Crossman, Howard Davis, and Larry Jacobson from Noank to see if they knew of any vessels that had gone down. They had no idea. They hadn't heard of a vessel that sounded like the one that we had found. But we've had two clues that helped us to base a date that it possibly went down. And one of them was the batteries that were on it. It was a diesel engine, 4-cylinder diesel engine. And a friend of mine mentioned to me, I was looking at the batteries and it looked like there was some writing on the batteries. Maybe that will help you to find out something about the vessel. So we went down, took off one of the battery caps, and it was a Sears Golden Jubilee battery, 1886 to 1936. So we knew if these batteries were part of the wreck, which we assume they were, that the vessel went down after 1936. So the second clue was off of the wreck, there was a large pile of oyster shells. And it was about 50 feet off the wreck, and there was an anchor that was buried in the pile of oysters. Now, we weren't sure if this oyster pile was part of the wreck or not because it was not right next to the wreck. It was a little ways away, but you don't usually find oyster shells like that on the bottom, let alone with an anchor in the middle of it that is buried. So that was sort of our second clue, which helped us in the end.
And this was in a pile?
It was in a pile. Mm-hmm. Just a pile of oyster shells. So that was our second clue. And now we worked on trying to identify this wreck for 5 years, and we came up with no clues. 2 bells that were on it, and neither one of them had any inscriptions on them to help us identify it. We found a silver pocket watch that had serial numbers on it, which we tried to trace back, but those records were unavailable. A klaxon horn that had serial numbers on it, but those were unavailable as well. the records for that were unavailable, so we weren't able to trace it back. Now I thought, and my thought on the wreck was that we knew it went down after 1936, and no one knew that it went down. How could no one know that a vessel, this was about 70 feet long, rather large vessel, how could this vessel have gone down right in the middle of Fisher's Island Sound and no one know about it and be lost to history? So I thought there must have been some sort of cataclysmic event that happened that would allow it to sink and no one know about it. So my first thought was the 1938 hurricane. There were about 5,000 vessels that were lost in the 38 hurricane, and it would have been easy for this vessel just to have been overlooked. This is where my research failed a little bit. I was focused on the 38 hurricane. So I was researching that and trying to look for vessels that were lost at that time period. And I was unable to find anything. So we were at a loss and a standstill, so I approached Joe Wojcicki of the day to see if he would write an article on the wreck, to see if we could involve the public, to see if they could help us, and they had some information about this wreck and help us identify it. And so Joe did. He wrote an article, and it was published. And 2 days later, I got an email from Joe that John Ruddy of the day had read the article, and he started doing his own research. And he thought that he had found possibly what this wreck was. And what John did, which I didn't do, was he went back to the terminus date, which would have been 1936. He started off in 1936 and started combing the records of the day and came up with an article for September of 1936 where a 70-foot vessel went down right off of Ram Island gas buoy, which is where this vessel is, in 75 feet of water, carrying a $2,000 load of oysters. She had run on the rocks at about 11 o'clock at night, had holed and was taking on water, and the 3 men that were on it got off the vessel, and the vessel ultimately sank. And they were picked up by the Coast Guard as well. So, although we don't have a absolute positive identity on the wreck,
Well, you got
I would say
close.
pretty
Right.
close, given all the
Absolutely.
information that we have.
Yeah.
And so that we were really excited that we had finally found the name, and we were able to look back at the records, and we went back to the merchant vessels of the U.S. to look at the records of to see if it fit that also, fit the description of the wreck, and it did. And I was thinking about it, and I thought, well, it was from Stratford, Connecticut, the vessel was, and it was going to Rhode Island with the oyster shells. And I started to think, I thought, well, it would be interesting if we were able to find a living relative, contact them, so that we could share the story that we had found this vessel. So my sister, Laura Janice Munro, she loves genealogy. She's done a lot of our family genealogy, so I spoke with her and asked her if she would be interested in taking on this project, and she was. So she was able to track down the granddaughter of the master of the vessel, of the Phyllis, and in spring of 2012, I contacted Beth Turner, who is the granddaughter of Charles Wakely, who was the master of the Phyllis.
And we met her at the opening of the exhibit
Did meet her
last
at
week.
the opening of the
Very
exhibit.
good.
And she was able to dig up some information with regard to her grandfather, which was one of the things that in the records that I had was Charles Cooper was the owner of the vessel. And Charles Wakely had bought the rights to the vessel just 6 months prior to her sinking. So he had just owned her for 6 months prior to her sinking. And Beth, one of the stories that she told me is that she had met her grandfather, Charles Wakely. He was living down in Florida at the time. She was 2 weeks old when she met him. She was just born. Her mother received word that he was failing, and they got on a train and went down to Florida, and she met him when she was 2 weeks old, and he passed shortly after that.
Great story, great detective work.
Yeah, so I think for me, shipwrecks, we were talking earlier about shipwrecks and why the fascination. For me, it's many faceted. I mean, I enjoy being on the water for one.
Yep.
I enjoy boats. I enjoy the challenge of looking for the wrecks, enjoy the challenge of diving the shipwrecks. Also enjoy the history. I think that's a big part of it.
Sure.
In sharing the story and the human element, whether it's the tragedy that happened or being in touch with the families and trying to provide them with information.
Now, if we have time, we'll get into some of the technology that you use to do this. But shall we show the 8-minute video?
Sure.
And we can talk over it and you can describe it.
Certainly.
So, Mary Jane, if you can show that.
So as I mentioned earlier, when we first dove it, we landed right in front of the engine. And this is pretty much right where we started our first dive. And this is the flywheel of the engine. And we're going to move towards the stern. So we're going over the top of the engine. And visibility in Fisher's Island Sound, most people think of diving in New England, especially in our area. In Long Island Sound, the visibility is absolutely poor. But we've had over the years, the last couple of years, I've had up to 30 foot of visibility.
That's great.
And this is probably about 10 foot of visibility.
Yeah.
And we're moving over the prop shaft here and the pillar blocks that would have supported the prop shaft. And what you see here is our grapple hook that goes up to the boat. So our boat is attached to the wreck as we're diving it. As we come off the end of the prop shaft, this is the rudder. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a wooden vessel, so it's been eaten away. The wood's been eaten away by shipworms. It's in a very dynamic area. There's heavy currents and also fishing activity, primarily lobstering. So over the years, parts of the vessel have been just fallen apart. You'll see parts of the deck and such on the bottom, but not an awful lot of it. So this is the top of the rudder. This is the mechanism that would have been used, attached to whatever was used to turn the rudder. We're going back down towards the rudder. And since it is in Fisher's Island Sound, I mentioned that the current, we typically dive it right at slack tide. So you have a slack tide about every 6 hours and 20 minutes. And tide can run through there about 3 knots. And you want to make sure that...
and that isn't even the race.
No. So you want to make sure that you're there at slack tide. So otherwise it's pretty hard to dive in those conditions in the middle of the tide. So this is the transmission that would have transferred the engine movement to the prop shaft. And here you can see the 4 cylinders from the diesel engine. We end up back at the flywheel. And also part of our research, I was in contact with some individuals at the seaport. One of the things that we tried to do was use this engine also to identify the wreck, possibly come down to what the manufacturer of the engine was, trace it back. But at the time period that we were looking at, they were just turning over from steam to diesel, and you would not believe the amount of manufacturers of diesel engines that there were in the state at the time, so it was hard to track it down. Those are the batteries that the battery caps came off of that helped us identify it. And this is on the keel of the vessel moving forwards. The keel was the strongest part of the vessel, basically the backbone of the vessel, so the strongest part. There's a lot of material there, so you see that's probably the highest quantity of wood that's on the wreck right now, lasted through the years. Still deteriorated and eaten by shipworms, but still prominent. We're coming up to the windlass that was on the bow. And I mentioned the type of vessel that we think it looked like was a Menhaden boat. So you had a wheelhouse forward, very far forward, and a working area in the middle, which would have been where Menhaden would have been put through and into the hold. And then over the top of the engine was a house that would have been more the living quarters. And that was the distribution of artifacts that we found correlated to that, so that we had spotlights forwards, the ship's wheel forwards, any of the working parts of the vessel forwards, and then there was a lot of living material, plates, cups, portholes, and things over the engine.
And in the exhibit, you have a photo of a ship that approximates that.
Correct,
Yeah.
yes. We have not found yet a picture of this vessel.
Sure.
This is typical what the area around the shipwreck looks like.
And so far as artifacts are concerned, you know, for example, the battery caps, that type of thing, are they shown in here, in this?
There are some photos at the end of this, yes,
Yeah.
of the artifacts.
No, this is at 65 feet, something like that?
75 feet.
75 feet. And,
That's a dead eye.
oh yes, that's
That
right.
would have been used sort of as a turnbuckle that we have today to hold the rigging up,
Right.
and that's a valve. Yeah. Now, Becky Gladich took a lot of these pictures. She went to Avery Point, and she's a biologist, so shipwrecks have other treasures other than just
Absolutely.
artifacts. Biology as well. She took a lot of
Yeah.
biology pictures, so I like to include those. John Stanford took a number of these photos as well.
Mhm.
That's the top to a fire extinguisher. That's the ship's flywheel again. The anchor that I was mentioning, just the palm of the anchor was sticking out, and this is me next to the palm. It was sticking out of the oyster shells. Some more parts to a battery. It's one of the horns that was found forwards, which would have been on the house. A sugar bowl that was back around the engine where the living quarters would have been. Another shot of the batteries. This was a pewter mirror that was found. Had a relief on the backside of it.
And all these are part of the exhibit at the Custom House Museum.
Correct.
Right.
And actually there's a high definition version of this video that plays as well.
Mm-hmm.
This is a serving platter that was found around the engine area. There's a hinge to a door. And the dead eye again. Or the biology. This is a stove that was a two-burner stove and oven that was next to the engine, and this is a porthole.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the ship's wheel. The
Great.
ship's wheel is up where the windlass was, so very far forward, so that's, as I was mentioning, one of the clues to where the wheelhouse was, and that's the palm of the anchor sticking out of the oyster shells again. Anemones on the wreck. It's a teapot.
And while all this is going on, what is the equipment that you're using?
Well, at the moment, we're sort of a mixed group. Originally...
That's very good.
Thank you. At the recreational diving, typically is done open circuit. So, and what open circuit is using tanks on your back with
Traditional scuba.
traditional scuba with a regulator where you breathe in compressed air out of a tank, and then your inhaled gas is breathed out and it goes into the water column, not to be used again. And
Makes bubbles.
makes bubbles, is noisy, not that efficient.
And very important to remember that when you're going up, if you're going up without the equipment, you don't hold your breath. You've got to continue exhaling.
Correct.
Otherwise, you rupture your lungs.
And that's one of the problems, I say problems, but one of the issues with open circuit is the deeper that you go, say you're using an aluminum 80, which has 80 cubic feet of gas in it. For every 33 feet that you descend, that volume of gas essentially is halved every 33 feet.
Yeah.
Because
1 atmosphere.
Correct, 1 atmosphere, because of the compression of the water. So the deeper you go, the shorter that gas will last you. And then the inverse on the way up, as you were mentioning, and that will expand so that you don't want to hold your breath. The other thing, as I mentioned, you're exhaling that gas. Now, the air that we breathe has about 21% oxygen in it, and we only use about 5% of that, so we're exhaling 16% of the oxygen that's in our breathing gas into the water column. And for most diving, open circuit diving is very safe and has fail-safe, so it's from equipment standpoint, it's very easy to use to start off with. But when on the wreck of the Phyllis, we'll just use that as an example. A typical dive on open circuit might last about 45 minutes before on a typical aluminum 80 for a typical diver at a typical breathing rate. I started using a device called a rebreather about 2000. And actually built my own first one that I used. I built my own, and a rebreather does exactly what it says. You're actually rebreathing your gas. So instead of expelling that gas that you inhaled back into the water column, you're recirculating it through the loop and reusing it.
And of course, you have to do something with the CO2.
You do, and you have a scrubber canister that's in that loop that takes the carbon dioxide out of the breathing loop. And you also have a tank of oxygen that you use to make up for the oxygen that you've inspired. And what that does is that since you're not expelling any of that gas into the water, you can dive on very little gas and stay underwater essentially. Primarily, for the most part, you're limited by the length of time that your carbon dioxide scrubber would work, and obviously the depth that you're at.
But now you have 3 gases to worry about. Number 1 is enough oxygen. Number 2 is not to overdose on the CO2. You get CO2 narcosis. And number 3 is the always important nitrogen that can get into your bloodstream.
Right, but the advantage of, and we'll go back to the example of using open circuit on the Phyllis at 75 feet. On open circuit, you could do a dive for about 45 minutes and have enough gas to do that dive and incur maybe a little bit of decompression obligation with that extra nitrogen that you were talking, because you take the nitrogen into your bloodstream and you have to let that out. Which
means you have to come up much more slowly.
Correct, and make decompression stops. Yeah. In contrast, on my rebreather, because I can put more oxygen into the loop so that there's less inert gas, so I'm not inspiring as much, I can do a dive for an hour and a half on the Phyllis at 75 feet and incur no decompression.
Is that right?
And use
no stops?
And no stops.
Wow.
And use and still have still have 2 hours left on my scrubber at least to do another dive.
But the important thing there is that you did not inhale as much nitrogen, which you would have had to provide time for to get rid of.
Correct. Yeah. So there's with the complexity comes advantages, and that's the right tool for the right job.
Yeah.
But it allows you, when you're on a shipwreck and you want to explore, it takes a lot of time and energy to get out to that shipwreck to explore it. So if you can extend your time from 20 minutes to 40 minutes, you're doubling your time.
Absolutely.
You're maximizing your time on the bottom, and in this case, going from 45 minutes to an hour and a half. That hour and a half is a long time to be able to spend exploring, looking, trying to find clues, and enjoying what's there.
And it's a great world down there.
It is.
Well, that's a terrific story. Can you tell us what is on the agenda, on your agenda for the future? What are you doing?
Well, we have a few wrecks in the Block Island area primarily that we have located that haven't been dove before, that we have identified and that we're trying to document. And it's just getting the time to do that and telling their story. We actually recently did find another wreck that we're sort of starting the process of the Phyllis all over again. We've located it, started diving it, but did not know it was there, and have not been able to identify it as of yet.
You mentioned something about a U-boat?
We had a project back in, I started in 2009. The U-550 was a U-boat that was sunk south of Nantucket and in April of 1944. And as East Coast U-boats go, she was one that was one of the last to be found that would have been in diveable waters. If you're unfamiliar, we actually have the U-853, which is just to the east of Block Island, which is a U-boat that was sunk. It was actually sunk after the war was declared over. And I had some of the gentlemen that I dived with that were very interested in diving the U-550. So in 2009, I started a project to try to locate the U-550. Now, going to look for a shipwreck in Fisher's Island Sound that's 5 miles offshore is relatively easy compared to 75 miles south of Nantucket.
Wow. And at what depth?
300 feet of water.
Wow.
I put together 2 trips, one in 2010 and one in 2012, to look for her, and were unsuccessful. And she was recently found by another group just this past year.
Do you know how she went down?
Well, that was one of the projects that I still have going, is in my research for the U-550. The first year of research was just trying to locate where she was, where she might be found. In my second year of research, I was thinking to myself, how can I take this further? What might help and what might be of interest historically? And I thought of the gentlemen, the sailors that were on the destroyer escorts that sank the U-550.
And you were able to find out what that was, who that was.
Who they were. So I started looking for, there were 3 destroyer escorts that sank her, the Joyce, USS Joyce, Gandy, and Peterson. And so I started working with a friend of mine, John Anderson, who owns a video production company in Stonington. And our first effort was we went to Pennsylvania for a destroyer escort reunion and started interviewing those sailors and having them tell us their story. And it was very interesting, and we continued with the project because not just for the U-550, but just to tell the story of the destroyer escorts, sailors that were out there protecting the convoys.
Absolutely.
So John and I have traveled all over the country interviewing these destroyer escort sailors, California, Florida, Pennsylvania, Carolinas. We've been all over the country interviewing them. We've done about 12 interviews with destroyer escort sailors, and we're going to continue that. I still have a number on my list that I would like to visit with, and
that has all the makings of at least one other TV show.
Well, hopefully it will contribute. I'm not sure what will happen with, now that they've found the other group has found the U-550.
Yeah. But you still have the story.
Right. Our primary interest is documenting and getting this information, because unfortunately there are fewer and fewer of these gentlemen around that were on the destroyer escort, so we're trying to catch them. There is actually one survivor that is still in Germany from the U-550 that we're hoping possibly to go visit and do an interview with. And this is all privately funded, primarily by myself, to do these interviews. So we're looking to hopefully do that, get some funds together to do that. And I do have a 3-minute tape of 3 interviews that we did at that our first visit down to the destroyer escort.
Okay, let's
reunion.
We've got 3 or 4 minutes, and folks, just remember a great deal going on at the Custom House Museum. Check it out at nlmaritimesociety.org. And as I always say, join the adventure, but this adventure is not over as yet, because we're going to show the 3-minute video, which is also an audio.
Correct.
So, Mary Jane, could you
you
end
have to
with
remember
that
that this
3-minute
was an
video?
explosion of manufacturing ability on the part of the United States, because the problem was they were not giving their ocean-going vessels with the food and things like that enough protection. They were losing too many of them. So somebody came up with the idea of it was a two-headed thing. They started Liberty ships, which were easy to make to carry food and what have, but then they started a program of escort vessels to protect them from the subs back and forth. And that's where the DEs came into play. They were specifically designed to be an escort vessel to protect the major shipping vessels from submarine attack. And frankly, it kind of gave you the willies, because early on they had so many subs out there, you really didn't, you kind of held your breath when you went to bed at night, I'll put it that way. So that was basically what happened with the DEs. They just flooded the ocean with these ships to protect the cargo vessels.
But the other ships, they picked up the sound of that submarine and dropped depth charges. That's why it surfaced. I think we fired a Hedgehog, which was contact bombs on the bow of the ship. There's 24 of them. They don't go off unless they're contact things. The depth charges you could set for any depth you wanted. And what the heck, we had, I think, 3 torpedoes shot at us, and they missed because I could see the wake of them torpedoes going through the water. Fortunately for us. And I don't know how deep them torpedoes were, but you know, a destroyer escort is shallow draft, and they could have passed under us for all I know. But, as far as the U-550, it was them or us, that's all.
Oh, we went to a couple different reunions. There was one in Fort Mitchell in Kentucky. There was one in Baltimore. Well, we've gone to different reunions, my wife and I. We liked that. And saw some guys. Every year there's less guys going to them. And chances are, I get this DE newspaper, they keep saying that chances are these are the last ones, because the guys that are still living are in their mid-80s, and they're dying off every day, and less guys going to the reunion. So, but we went to as many as we could, enjoyed them too.